Good morning, everyone. It's a cold December morning here, and today I'm introducing a new car to the channel. Well, the car is new to the channel, but the car itself is not exactly new. It's a 2014 Kia Sportage with a 2-liter diesel engine making 184 horsepower, 6-speed automatic. This used to be my car up until a couple of years ago when I got the Range Rover. Now it's my dad's car. And the reason I'm filming today is because it needs a full front brake job, rotors and pads. Also, I decided to join the 21st century and I bought myself a tripod for my phone, so I don't have to carry my phone with me all the time in my hand when I'm working, and I can show you more detailed action as I work. With that said, what's going to happen in this film is, first of all, I'm going to show you how to figure out when the pads and rotors are due, and then I'm going to try and do as detailed and as thorough a job as I can when changing the rotors, because this is the first time I'm filming a front brake job on a car on the channel, and I think it's important that I try to point out all the essential details for you guys if you want to try and tackle this yourselves. With that said, let's first raise the car up and I'll show you how to figure out when the components need changing. Stick around. Right, we have jacked the car up and put it on two 3-ton jacks. As you can see on the right side, it's also held by the car's jack. So underneath it's pretty secure. As always, I will emphasize again and again, never work underneath a car that's supported only by the car's jack. Use jack stands like these. These are pretty solid. And secondly, make sure that the handbrake is applied and the car is in park or in first gear. Now we know that the car is secure and we can take the front wheels off. In order to remove the lug nuts, you will need a 19mm hex, and I'm using my electric impact wrench for this. Should be a quick job. And sure enough, out comes the wheel. Now that the wheels are off, let's examine the state of the brakes and explain why they should be changed on my car and how you can tell if yours need changing. So number one, take a look at the rotors. If you see any radial cracks emerging on the rotors, that's a sign that they will need changing. The rotors also develop a lip over time. You can see it right here as the pads eat away from the materials. These are typically made from cast iron, not steel. It's cast iron. And ours does have a lip, and we'll measure it in a few minutes to show you exactly how much thickness the disc lost. And with regards to pads, you can just do a simple visual inspection. Looking here, you can see that the pad material on this side is almost completely worn. And if you take a look on the other side, this is the right hand side, you can see that not only the pad material has been also completely worn here, you'll see that it's actually started to eat from the surface of the rotor. Okay, when it gets to this point, you can't really reuse the rotor anymore. You either have to machine it to get a new clean surface, but given the fact that the new rotors, even quality ones, don't tend to be particularly expensive, I would just recommend swapping them with new rotors. Okay, so because this rotor is damaged, that's one criteria why we're going to replace them both. Also, because the pads are worn, we're going to replace them as well. Now regarding pads, Typically, theory says that they should be replaced whenever the pad material has worn down to about less than 3 millimeters. But that's not really something you can measure with ease. So one thing you can do is you can just take like a quarter, like the thickest one you can find. This one, for example, has about 2 millimeters in thickness, and just try and place it between the disc and the pad bracket here. If it can get in between the two, it means that the pad thickness exceeds 2 millimeters. So you still have a little bit to go, but it is due changing. If, for example, as is the case here, it doesn't really get in between the two, then you really should change them right now. Okay, lastly, let's discuss the thickness of the disc. In the case of the Sportage 2-liter diesel all-wheel drive with 184 horsepower, the rotor specification says that brand new rotors should be 28 millimeters thickness, and the minimum thickness after which they should be changed is 26.4. Quick mention here why this is important, because you might say, well, even if it goes below the minimum, you still have a lot of meat on the discs. That is partially true, but the fundamental problem is this. Typically, the ability of a disc to dissipate heat is directly proportional with its mass, and that is directly proportional with its thickness. Once you go beneath the minimum thickness recommended by the manufacturer, your braking system is no longer capable of being 100% efficient, right? And given the importance of braking, I really wouldn't suggest taking your chances. As you'll see at the end of the video, it's not terribly expensive to do this job yourself. And because these are front brakes, so these take the most important, the biggest part of the effort when you brake, it's a really, really good idea to change them whenever they go below minimum spec. Now, when gauging thickness, you use one of these things. Unfortunately, I don't have the version that also has the small tips. Those are dedicated for measuring brake thickness. I just have a standard one, which is why I'm also going to be using two of these. And what I'm going to do, I'm simply going to place them on both sides. I pick a spot and place them on both sides. Measure the combined thickness. This is 29.98, so about 30 millimeters. And then all I do is I simply subtract their combined thickness, which is 4 millimeters, and that tells me that the thickness of the disc in this point is 26 millimeters, which is already below the specified 26.4. So all in all, we know that we do need to change the pads because they're worn out, and we do need to change the discs because on this side it's below minimum thickness, and chances are it's the same on the other. And on the other side, on the right one, we've also damaged this lip here. The third reason you might consider changing your rotors is if you get brake judder. There's a long theory on where brake judder comes from, but the summary of it is this: if it doesn't really go away after applying the brakes more firmly for a couple of times, it means either that your rotors have warped by themselves from overheating. That can happen, though it's small chance of them actually being warped. The bigger chance is you have overheated the system entirely, and some pad material has actually fused on the surface of the rotors, and it's created a small what's the word, bump. Okay, that thing is called cementite, and typically that thing doesn't really go away after you keep applying the brakes. So that's the third scenario where you will need to change both rotors and pads. And with all the theory done, let's start disassembling. The first disassembly step is we need to remove the top and the bottom screws that hold the caliper in place, connected to the caliper guide pins. And for that you will need a 17mm hex to hold the caliper guide pin in place like this, and then a 14mm hex on the bolt itself, like this. I've already slackened them a bit, but you get the idea. Before removing the second bolt, i.e. before the caliper itself can be taken out, you may need to introduce a little separation between the rotor and the pad. Otherwise, it might actually be difficult to take the caliper out. For this, you use a flathead screwdriver that you gently insert between the rotor and the pad, and you simply need to create a very small separation, like a millimeter or so. I've already done it, and that should give you enough space. Do be careful with this, because the flathead screwdriver will scratch the rotor. You can do this without any issues if you plan on removing the rotor and changing it, but if you plan on reusing it, for example, let's say you just wanted to replace the wheel bearing or something, in that case, just try and be as careful as you can and try and scratch the pad more than you scratch the disc. Okay. The caliper is out. You can see it here, suspended by a bungee cord. This is a very important detail. After you remove the caliper, never ever let it rest on the brake fluid line, because there's a real risk of tearing this apart, and you don't want that happening. Always suspend it from any solid part of the car, like the suspension or something, with whatever. I'm using a bungee cord, which is sufficient for the job. Now let's take a look at the pads. So let's remove the outer pad, and as we've said, you can clearly see its thickness right here. So it's like, I don't know, maybe like at most 1mm thickness. The inner pad should be ever so slightly more interesting. Let's take it out. Okay, let's see what we got. So looking at this one, you'll actually notice that it's worn more on this side here. It's thinner here than it is on this side. Now this is the inboard side, right? So this side is where the disc comes into the caliper. So that kind of makes sense, but it also means that we need to pay special attention to the caliper guide pins, which appear to be moving well, pretty smoothly, but we will be cleaning and re-greasing these at the end, just to be extra safe. The next step is to remove the caliper brackets. Now these are held by two bolts on the inside. Talking about this one, and let's see if I can show it. This one over here, both 17mm hexes. And because we're working on the front, I'm gonna do as Chris Fix suggests, and that is like work with your car. And that means I'm just gonna turn the steering wheel so I can expose those bolts for easier access. Just like that, you see, and now I have far more access for both. And because these are pretty tight, they should be tight to about 100 Newton meters. You can just go ahead and use a breaker bar to remove them. On the left side, it needs to go from bottom to top. Just like that. And obviously on the right side, it should be top to bottom. Okay, slacken them off. Yeah, that's my dog. and out comes the caliper bracket. Now we'll come back to this a bit later. At this point you can analyze the state of these two bolts. If they're overly rusted, you should replace them with two new OEM ones, but that is my case. They look pretty good, so I'm just gonna stick to them. The last thing to do before physically removing the discs is we have to take out these two screws. As you can see, they're Phillips screws, and I can tell you they're terribly annoying to remove. They can be stuck on, and I've already tried removing this one with a normal screwdriver, and for all my attempts, all I got was starting to strip the threads. So I'm going to be using the impact wrench again. A rather interesting setup. Let's see if it works. Okay, this was very easy. Let's see if we get lucky on the second. Yep, we did. So yeah, having an impact wrench or something is terribly helpful in these situations. I won't be reusing those. I think the Phillips head is quite maybe quite difficult to remove. I bought new ones which actually have Torx heads. Okay, and at this point we should be ready to remove the disc. So let's see if we can remove it by hand. And as I expected, we can't. That's because it is rusted onto the hub. And how we go about solving this problem? Again, if you don't need the disc anymore, just grab like a hammer and hit on the surface of the disc. Don't hit around this area, hit only on the surface of the disc, because you want to create, by applying force in this point or around these areas, you want to create maximum torque to try and break the rust seal inside. If on the other hand you want to reuse the disc, then I suggest maybe taking a bit of plywood and putting it between the disc and the hammer, so you don't actually damage the surface of the rotors. So let's see if we get lucky. Yeah, we're just gonna keep on trying. And after a couple of really good smacks with the hammer, as you can see, they've already made the mark. As I said, the disc decided to come out, and out it goes. Right, I'm gonna go and do the same on the other side, and then it's assembly time. That's always gonna start with a bit of cleanup. And just for fun, well, quote, let me show you guys something. Just remove the support screws from the right hand disc and take a look at this one. See if the camera focuses. Do you see how stripped it is? I actually found it like this. This was done by the place where I normally service the car while the Kia was in warranty. And I'm actually really surprised that whoever worked on these brakes didn't have the, I would say, decency to just swap this thing, and they just put it back on. Okay, good thing I actually bought, as I said, new ones, and you can see the new ones are actually Torx heads. Now Torx heads are ever so slightly more difficult to strip than the Phillips screws, so there's no way I'm putting back those Phillips screws. I'm gonna use the new ones. Just ranting. And I just wanted to take this small shot, quoting from Men in Black 1, which is like, old and busted and new hotness. Yeah, so really looking forward to installing the new components. Cleaning time. This is, I would say, among the most important things you need to do when swapping your brakes, because the end result is you want to have the hub surface as flat as possible. If it's not flat and you put the rotor on it, you might exceed the runout and you'll get vibrations and you'll damage the rotor. So to go about cleaning, use a metal brush, I've seen guys just using a metal brush and rubbing it by hand. I think that's just not thorough enough, so I'm using it connected to a power tool, and a few cans of brake clean, and the face mask, absolutely, because this is gonna dust like everything. And just go about progressively cleaning, wiping off the dirt with the brake cleaner, and so on until you get a more or less shiny surface. You get the idea. And here's the hub after about 20 minutes of cleaning. I've cleaned the surface, this area, the outer rim, as well as this area around here inside. Now we're really close to actually installing the new disc, but before that we need to apply something that will prevent the new disc from rusting like the old one did, rusting on the hub. Now many people use copper grease, though personally I'm not a big fan of copper grease. I've actually read some documentation from I think it was Delphi, one of the tier 1s, that specifically recommends against using copper grease. So instead I'm using this thing, Techstar Ceratec. It's a sort of ceramic non-conductive grease specifically designed for brake parts, i.e. it maintains lubrication even at higher temperatures. And I'm just going to apply some of it uniformly across the entire surface of the hub and the outer rim. All the areas that may come in contact with the new disc and where rust might form. Then after having applied the grease uniformly, finally it's time to install the new rotors. Just make sure that you align the two holes for the small bolts with the holes in the hub. And here it goes. Let's see here. Okay, should be something like this. Right, okay. And after we put the disc in its place, it's time to add the two supporting screws, the small ones. These ones that I got, as I said, are a Torx T30, and the question is, what's their tightening torque? Couldn't find anything on the documentation that I have. So what I did was I took a look at the bolt itself, and as you can see at the bottom of it, it says 10.9. And I measured its thickness, which is M6. So this is an M6 bolt with a 10.9 grade steel. And then I just Googled online and found out that the maximum torque for these is 17 Newton meters. So we'll definitely not torque them that high. But 14 Newton meters, sorry, should be sufficient. One thing I do like about these rotors, unlike the rotors from the Range Rover, is that they actually have two opposing screws, which makes the rotor uniformly flat with the hub, and that's gonna make the run-out measurements a lot easier. There you go. And as I said, we're now gonna tighten to 14 Newton meters. Hold the rotor in place. By the way, never touch the surface where the pads are gonna rub on. Just keep on the side. A little bit more. Okay, that's 14. And the same with the second one. That's 14. Cool, all done. New rotors in place. All we need to do now is measure the run out to make sure that the rotor is up to spec. And onwards to the run out measurements. To turn the wheel, I'm using a 32 hex directly on the central hub nut, and we're looking for a value underneath or around 25 thousandths of a millimeter. So first spin, it's about 20, then hovering about 10. There obviously are some minor imperfections on the surface of the disc because it's still the coating that's also present. But in any case, doing a full circle yields values under or around 20 thousandths of a millimeter. I'm looking at the gauge as I'm speaking. So we're within spec. That is very, very good. So we're done with installing the disc on this side. Now I'm gonna go and repeat the exact same steps on the right side, and then we're gonna move on with installing the other components. I've installed the rotor on the other side as well. Both of them are within spec regarding runout, so less than or around 0.025 millimeters. Just bear in mind that whatever value you measured is going to be smaller in practice, because once you've put the wheel, it's gonna make the rotor sit even better to the hub. So the fact that with the rotors like this we're within spec is obviously a good thing. And after that, one important idea. These are all coated rotors. You've seen in the Range Rover video as well that I like these coated rotors. They don't need to be cleaned with brake cleaner before installation. But if you had bought, for example, normal rotors that are not coated, those are usually delivered with a covering of oil on the surface to prevent rust, and that oil does need to come out. So in that case, you do need to clean the surface of the disc with brake cleaner before installation. And with that, we move on to work on the caliper bracket. This is the one for the right hand side. Obviously, we will do the same for the left hand side. So number one, you need to remove these shields, 1 and 2. You just use a normal screwdriver to make them come apart, something like this. If the new pad set that you bought comes with new shims, then you can throw these away, but our set didn't, so we will be reusing these, which means that we have to clean them. And apart from the shims, you want to clean the entire caliper bracket, but focused most importantly in the areas where the shims are placed, because what usually happens, dirt actually gets in between the shim and the bracket, like here. It pushes the shim down, and that shim makes the pads more difficult to move side to side, okay? And then you might end up having sticking pads and lower mileage and overheating brakes and bad stuff. So spend time cleaning this. After we're done cleaning, we're gonna take a look at the caliper guide pins, which is this one and this one. And what you're looking for is you're looking for rubber that's not cracked. It should be, the rubber itself should be in good condition. In our case, apart from a little bit of dirt, this one is fine. And we're also looking at the one at the bottom, which also seems to be fine. Taking a look at them, so the rubber's fine, but we will also be taking the pins out for cleaning and re-lubrication, but I'll get to that a bit later. So onwards to cleaning the mounting brackets. I've spent a good part of 15 minutes cleaning the right hand side mounting bracket, this one. If you remember, it was pretty dark and ugly before. Now it looks pretty good. But I want to draw your attention to one important aspect. Take a look at the guide pins. Okay, you see they're different. One of them is pure steel, the other one has a rubber grommet in the head. Now, the one with the rubber grommet always goes on the inboard side. The inboard side is the side in which the brake disc goes inside the bracket as the car is moving forward. Because this thing is placed like this at the front of the rotor when the car is moving forward, it means that this guide pin goes here and this one goes there. This is important, okay? Don't mix them up. Okay. And with the caliper bracket cleaned, I've also spent some time cleaning the inside of the places where the guide pins go. This was a bit tricky, but what I did, I just used a clean rag and a screwdriver, and I've covered the rag on the head of the screwdriver and just stuck that in and twisted, and that did a pretty good job. And a number of times I used the brake cleaner inside. I repeated the process for about 5 or 6 times for each of the holes until the brake cleaner came out, no longer came out dirty. At this point, all I have to do on the right side is clean the 2 guide pins with a rag or whatever. Okay, inspect the 2 rubber mounts, and as you can see, they're in good shape. Good shape means they're not torn. There's no risk of humidity and dirt going inside the guide pin holes. And after I've cleaned these 2, I'm going to apply the same kind of high temperature ceramic grease. So again, not copper grease, the same kind of grease, and install them back in. And here are the pins after cleaning up, greasing up, and putting the rubber boot back on. As I said, this goes on the inboard side, which is here. You should just push slowly until the rubber sits properly inside the mounting bracket. It's not in there yet. I'll do it separately. You might need a small screwdriver or something to guide it in. And the other pin, the outboard one, goes on the bottom. And after cleaning up the 2 metal shims that sit on the mounting bracket, you'll notice that I've applied a little bit of grease, same type of brake grease that I've used before, on the points where the shims actually mount to the bracket. Now, why did I do this? Obviously the shims won't move relative to the bracket, but this grease makes them sit better and prevents dirt and other things from getting in as the car goes on. So, with that done, all we have to do is just put the shims back. You see I've cleaned them as best I could. And just, they should sit well. And they do. This is one, and here's the second one. They might even click. Like that. Cool. And with that done, this is ready for reinstallation. So we'll move on to the right side and install this. All right, installation time. You'll notice that I have applied some medium strength thread locker on the 2 bolts that hold the caliper bracket in place. So now all we have to do is take the bracket, gently slide it in, try not to touch the rotor too much, and it's a bit of trial and error until, all right, there it goes. That's one bolt, and here's the second one. You can tighten them by hand for a good portion of their travel. Then at the end, using your 17mm hex, that should be the other way, sorry. tighten until you can no longer tighten by hand. And we're gonna go grab the torque wrench. Now the torque spec for these two bolts that connect the caliper bracket to the hub is between 76 and 98 Newton meters. To be honest, I did find that a bit surprising, because when I did the front brakes on the Range Rover, these asks for 275 Newton meters. So these values are comparatively low, but we do what the manual says. And I chose 95 Newton meters. So let's torque them down. That's one. That's two. Right. So we've installed the bracket on this side. Next I'm gonna go do the cleanup installation of the bracket on the left side as well. And then we can move on to the new pads. And just for the sake of completion, here's the left side as well. All cleaned, greased, shims cleaned, put in position. Everything is fine. Just need to torque up the two bracket bolts. That's one. That's two. Awesome. So that's done. Next, we need to move on to pads and caliper. Now, with regards to calipers, there's a couple of things you need to do. The first thing, you start by cleaning this outer rim. Make sure it's as clean as you can get it. The rest, the inside and stuff, doesn't really matter that much. Number two, do a visual inspection of this rubber seal and make sure you don't have brake fluid leaking. If you have brake fluid leaking, this means you might need to rebuild your caliper. In our case, that's not really happening, so that's good. And the last thing is, you need to push the pin all the way back. There are several tools you can use for this. I just have like a 10 centimeter C-clamp, and I use one of the old brake pads. Just put it here, and with the C-clamp in place, just twist until the caliper piston is pushed all the way back, slowly. Take your time, don't rush. And when winding the pistons back, it's up to you if you want or not, but I usually choose to open the brake fluid reservoir just a little bit so that any excess pressure, air pressure, can come out. Okay? Do note that once you're doing this push, the level of the fluid will rise, so you need to make sure that the brake fluid doesn't overfill. Right, because brake fluid is pretty nasty, damages paint, etc., etc. And just to show you what I mean, the simple fact that I pushed in the two front pistons all the way raised the brake fluid level from this line, it was right around this plastic line, all the way over here. Not sure if you can see it, but it's now above max. It was right about halfway, and now it's above max. Okay. Now, with regards to pads, I went with the most expensive pads I could find, and these are ATE ceramic. I did a bit of research on that. They claim that ceramic pads make far less noise and wear out much slower. Hoping that's the case, but we'll have to wait and see. And as you can see, the set comes with two pads that also have these small shims. These will scratch against the disc when the pad material has worn too much, to let you know that it's time to change them. And what we have to do now is we have these metal shims that we took off from the old pads that actually go, if you can imagine, like this. So they sit on top of the piston and they need to be attached to the inner pads. One last thing about the pads, there is the concept of directional pads. Directional pads typically have an arrow or something that needs to match the rotation direction of the discs as the car is moving forward. But as I've seen with these ones, I looked at them, there's no arrow, so these are not directional. And looking at them, they seem to be pretty symmetric. So yeah, I'm gonna put the shims, one bit there, and then I should push until they sit properly. That's one, and the same goes for the second. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. Okay, there we go. So I've put the shims on, and now I'm gonna apply some grease, the same kind of brake grease as I used before, but only on and around these tips. These are the tips that slide inside on the side of the caliper, and they need to be greased to make sliding easier. You can, if you want, apply some grease between the metal shim and the surface of the pad. In this case I won't, because of the claim that these are very quiet, so in theory there shouldn't be a need for extra grease for additional quietness. Whatever you do, do not apply any kind of oil, grease, etc. on the pad surface. With that said, let me grease them up and install them. And I've installed the pads on the left side. Now all I have to do is put the caliper back on. So I release it from the bungee cord and I hold it firmly. Make sure you don't drop it or anything. You don't want to be putting any excess pressure on the brake fluid line. And since we have pushed the piston in, as you can see, the caliper slides into position very easily. And lastly, we take the two caliper pin bolts. Now, if the pad package came with new bolts, use the new bolts. Ours didn't, so we're just going to use the ones we have and start by tightening everything by hand. Something like that. At which point we know the caliper is not going to fall. Remove the bungee cord. You don't want to have that thing forgotten there. Who knows what it can do. And the last thing is we need to torque those last two bolts. Now for the torque specs, the manual gives an interval between about 20 and 31 Newton meters. I chose about 28, and didn't know where the key was. Just as before, you need a 17mm hex to hold the pin in place, and with your torque wrench, okay, go until it clicks. That's one. That's two. Perfect. So we're officially done on this side. All we have to do is put the wheel back on. I'm gonna go and do the same on the right side, and then catch you guys after the car's ready to roll. And 2 points that I forgot to mention, but I still want to touch on. Number one, be absolutely careful to not install the pads the wrong way. Apparently, there's been cases of that. Never happened to me, but heard about them. And even the instructions on the box explicitly say do not install them the wrong way. I.e., you should always have the pad material facing the disc and not the other way around. Because if you do install them the wrong way and drive for 5 minutes, you've ruined your pads and your rotors. Right. Number two, the pad with the wear indicator, that small tab, this one here, goes on the inside. Right, on the inside. Right. So onwards to installing the wheels. I've installed the wheels, and the tightening torque for the wheel lug nuts according to the manual is between about 88 and 107 Newton meters. I chose about 102. This wheel is the last one to be tightened, and when you tighten, always tighten in a star pattern. So this one, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we are done with changing the brakes. Moving on inside the car, we now need to do two things. The first one is simple. We need to press the brake pedal until we feel it firm. The first couple of presses will be very, very light. And see, only on the third press do I actually feel that it's pushing back. So why did we do this? The issue is we pushed those caliper pistons all the way back, and when we installed them back, there was still a couple of millimeters gap between the new pads and the pistons pushed all the way. And we needed to apply the brake a couple of times to force the pistons onto the new brake pads. During that first brake push that you saw me at the start, when the pedal went all the way to the bottom, effectively I had no brakes because the pistons were only about to reach the new pads. Okay, that's why I did this. So do not forget this, otherwise the first time you'll try to brake, you'll have no brakes. And the second thing you need to do is you need to drive the car and start bedding in the new pads and rotors. Now the AT documentation that I've used, I'll discuss the components in a couple of seconds when I touch on the costs, specifically state that you should drive very carefully and avoid sudden hard brakes for the first, say, 200 kilometers. Personally, I would advise going a bit more, maybe 300 to 400 kilometers, during which you must do your best to not do any kind of forced braking. Otherwise, you risk warping your rotors, and you risk starting having brake judder. What I normally do in this situation, but I won't film it because I've shown it when I changed the rear rotors on the Range Rover, is I go out on an open road and do about 10 cycles where I accelerate to 80 kilometers an hour, and then do a gentle braking down to about 20 kilometers an hour, then speed up again, brake again, and so on about 10 times. And afterwards, do the procedure that I explained before. Okay, with that done, let's move on to the closing remarks. Number one has to do with safety. As I always emphasize whenever I'm working on brakes, you have to be absolutely sure of what you're doing and be extra careful, because brakes are essential to the well-being of your car and to you. If you're not comfortable with changing the brakes yourself, I strongly recommend going to an experienced mechanic or having someone with experience help you out. I'm hoping this video will be a guide to anyone out there, but as always, I can't claim any responsibility if you decide to do the job yourself. So please be extra careful. I try to cover all the steps in detail with patience, to make sure that I give you a full detailed procedure on how to swap the brakes on the front brakes on a Kia Sportage. Number two, let's discuss costs, as always. I went to a Kia dealer and asked for a quote for full front brakes replacement. They quoted me about 370 euros. OEM parts. I went with aftermarket parts by ATE. As always, I only choose the best possible brands that I can find. ATE is an OEM for German brands, and they do very good quality braking components. I've also used ATE on the Range Rover, so they've been behaving quite well. So I went with Ate this time as well. Rotors as well as the Ate ceramic. I heard quite good about them, so looking forward to see how they behave. They were the most expensive pads that I could buy. And doing the math on the cost, the rotors were about 50 euros each. The pads were about 90 euros. The 4 small screws that keep the rotors in place were 3 euros, which brings me up to a total of 193. Let's round up to 200 because I've also used like grease and everything. So yeah, nearly half of what the dealer quoted, and I'm pretty sure that the brakes that I installed will behave very, very well. So with that said, thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye.